Hello, Nayantara. Thank you for joining us in this interview, which is part of the South Asian Avant-Garde anthology. It's good to have you.
Thanks for having me. Sounds like and looks like you guys are doing really interesting work. So thank you for including me.
Thank you. So I'll just introduce Nayantara. Nayantara Gurung Kakshapati lives in Kathmandu, Nepal, and works at the intersections of visual storytelling, research, pedagogy, and collective action. In 2007, she co-founded Photo Circle, a platform that facilitates learning, exhibition making, and publishing opportunities for Nepali photographers. In 2011, she co-founded Nepal Picture Library, a digital archiving initiative that works towards diversifying Nepali social and cultural history. She's also the co-founder and festival director of Photo Kathmandu, an international festival that takes place in Kathmandu every 2 years. So if I can just begin by asking you to briefly describe these two major activities within the Photo Circle, if you could briefly introduce them and also, how they were born. And finally, if you think these were in some ways linked to the kind of political and social transformation that happened in Nepal since the end of the conflict.
Yeah, no, I guess to start with the last question, as a way to talk about how it began, I think it very much did start for us as a way to, engage with the political transformations that were happening in Nepal. I had personally been, living and studying away, and I moved back in 2006, just in time to sort of run around on the streets to be a part of the Second People's Movement, which was early 2006. And, it was very much sort of that sense of change and people, really wanting and working on creating inclusion at various levels, whether it be, sort of at the state level, but also on various social fronts. And so for us, of course, photography and the visual medium being our sort of primary entry point. It was really, Photo Circle was set up really with the intention of trying to create community for visual practitioners to be able to work together and to be able to, engage with all these changes that we were living through at the social and political levels. So I think Nepal Picture Library also originated from that sort of sense of wanting to engage with creating more inclusive narratives, not only contemporary narratives moving forward, but an attempt to look at our past also and to try to see what the histories that we don't know about. Growing up, we all studied a very particular kind of history in school. Curriculum taught us mostly about the powerful aristocracy and a particular kind of linear history teaching that often happens within curriculums. So the archive, Nepal Picture Library, has been an attempt to try to diversify our narratives of our past in Nepal, to have to look at more sort of historically overlooked and marginalized histories of specific communities, whether that be along the lines of caste or ethnicity or gender, and begin to, create repositories even for ourselves to begin to make larger claims, right, of the past. So that's kind of been the journey, and I have to say it's been quite an exciting time. I think there's a lot to engage with around us. So yeah.
So I'm just curious how, what kind of sources, what the process was for that body of photographs to kind of be there, and then how you decided to kind of edit it and put it together. And and what you felt the impact was, particularly in the public showings and in that form.
Right. At the outset, I suppose I should mention that, we were a group of visual storytellers, visual practitioners coming together to begin this kind of archiving work. We are not trained archivists or historians, so I think our approach has been quite sort of DIY, shall we call it, and I think we've really pushed ourselves to try to figure out, what the best and the most meaningful and practical way of doing this is. So I think our approach has been less from a formal institutional sort of archive approach, and more from visual practitioners approaches, and also from the approach of sort of really thinking about usability and really thinking about, well, who are we trying to create this repository for, and who is meant to engage with this, and what that means in terms of negotiating access, taking decisions. Just the fact that we decided right from the get-go that it has to be a digital archive, because we really felt we did not have the technical expertise, nor did we have the resources to really be looking at material collections, and to some extent we were less interested in the materiality of the of the photographs and the other objects that were coming in, and more interested in looking at sort of the significance of where these collections and materials pointed us to in terms of looking at Nepali society, history, public history work at large. And we've been digital right from the get-go. We feel like access is also, or at least where we are placed, and the kind of institutional form that we have, that we are best placed to open up access, having it be a digital repository. For us, the archive is really something that we want to take forward as a dialogical space and process. We don't want it to be just a dump that people don't really care for. We want it to be part of ongoing contemporary conversations and narratives, and we try our best to try to insert ourselves into public and intellectual life by really creating outputs constantly as much as we input into the archive. So as we archive, we're trying to constantly publish, whether it be in local media or books, as you said. We're trying to exhibit, we're trying to do other kinds of sort of seminars and other kinds of programming around the material and through the material. So I think that for us, that cyclic kind of way of working has been important for us. And it's also our way to engage with our communities, the communities whose histories we are trying to archive, and have it be like a, have it be a quick turnaround also in terms of also to create feedback loops, and to, we realize each time we put material out, people really respond, and I mean, there is this sense, as we said earlier, this sense of wanting to participate in the national discourse, this sense of wanting to be included. So, yeah.
And I mean, when you say putting it out, in your case, it literally means putting it out on the streets, and that engagement and participation in many cases is physical participation also, right? I just wanted to get some more details, and especially for those who might not be following kind of Nepali history and the details of that closely, to kind of, if you could quickly describe both these two major series that I mentioned, the one on Dalits in Nepal and the other on women, and kind of what was the standard framework of understanding that history, or maybe it wasn't even mentioned, that prominently, uh, and what kind of interventions, in terms of stories and narratives you feel the archives that you guys put together did?
So the first project that you mentioned, Dalit Quest for Dignity, was our first concerted effort to look at a particular history, and the history of a particular movement also, and caste being, one of the biggest underlying sort of issues of, sort of exclusive exclusion in society. We decided to start there. It was also one of our first big projects with Divas Raja Kisi, who is now very much part of the Nepal Picture Library. He heads our research and archives. And this collaboration with Divas, who has a more formal training, a history training, has been, I think, the beginning of, sort of ways of working with people interested in history making, more formal ways of history making. And so we started with the Dalit book. As you said, there's so little, there's very little record keeping that happens even institutionally. I think a lot of movements and institutions in Nepal are fairly young, if one were to compare at a even regional, scale. And so for us here in Nepal, there's very little material that we can reference. And so it began with working with personal, individual archives of people who are very much involved in the Dalit movement, since the 40s, 50s, 60s, and also a few institutional archives, organizations that have been looking to preserve Dalit history and working in the intellectual space on Dalit right issues even today. And so it was an attempt to create, again, not a linear history of the movement necessarily, but to look at a kind of a particular kind of past. And the visual sort of approach, I think, allows us to reach, we realize, much wider audiences and perhaps also younger audiences. And so to bring attention to particular things that have happened. The second project, the Feminist Memory Project, was with a similar approach. And the project has meant many things to many of us who've been a part of it. I think for me, one of the things that it does most importantly is really highlighting sort of multiplicity within the feminist movement here, and to look at the diverse ways in which women were engaging with feminism, and sort of taking feminist action and leading public lives, because the exhibition at the end, we've called it the public life of women, and to really sort of to examine what this publicness has meant for women in the last several decades, and looking at the movement. And for each of these projects, as you mentioned, we've tried to, put it out in the public sphere through books and publications of different forms also, working through mainstream media. And right now, for example, actually just yesterday, we started a really fun collaboration with this very active young woman on Instagram. Her handle is the Nepali Feminist. She's like the Nepali Feminist. And so she started, putting out the archive slowly. And so we're trying to reach young people, older people, reach people in different spaces and have this work be in different spaces. Yeah.
I mean, that brings me to the most recent exhibition, if one can call it, of the NPL series, which is The Skin of Chitwan. It's and it's about this part of area of Nepal which saw a history of migration and destruction of indigenous livelihoods, ecology. So I mean, there's a lot kind of social and ecological processes that one sees. But the interesting thing is, and I wonder if this is because of the pandemic, it's all on the internet, or that's the way it's been exhibited now, right? Could you can you kind of tell us again the story behind that particular series and why it landed up the way it did?
Yeah, so this particular project started about a year ago. We were interested to look at issues around indigeneity, and trying to connect it to, issues around the ecology and about thinking about the future. A lot of this thinking and these conversations here in Nepal have happened within a certain framework that is quite sort of polarized. It is either like conservation work that really looks about protecting, our forests and our waters and so on. And on the other end of that spectrum, it's a lot of work that is happening within a very rights-based framework on issues of land rights and landlessness, particularly for indigenous people. And so we were really trying to see, if we could kind of complicate our understanding of these issues a little bit, and to see like what is this spectrum and what are we missing out in between these kind of polar narratives that have been established quite well here thanks to a lot of development funded work actually. And also now more sort of political work as well, of course. So the project started out as an inquiry to see where things could. We ended up in Chitwan. That was not necessarily the plan right at the beginning, but fieldwork. So we started fieldwork in a few places, and we decided to stick to Chitwan for now. These are sort of all ongoing projects for us. Because obviously Chitwan has a very particular history. We also began to find archives of images, but other material, and began to meet collaborators who we could work with, one of them being the Tharu Cultural Museum and Research Center that's based in Chitwan, and to see their interest in sort of looking at a particular Tharu history, and but interestingly for Chitwan being Chitwan, given that tourism is quite a big mainstay, a certain kind of history telling that was happening for tourism and livelihood purposes also. This museum exists. Given the lack of support for this kind of work, it does exist largely on entry fees that tourists pay, for example, to come to see, visit a museum at a particular site. So that's how it started. Of course, then, the world turned upside down. The pandemic hit, and we were not able to continue our field work, but we were continuing to work with the museum remotely. The online exhibition, we decided to put it online, definitely given the circumstances now. It was meant to be a physical exhibition, and it was meant to ideally be at the Tharu Museum in Chitwan. But the online space has allowed us to experiment in many ways that was, I think, we had not planned to do. So yeah, it's been an interesting experiment.
Yeah. Now moving from the archival side of photo circles work to the more contemporary kind of photo festivals, could you kind of introduce what the photo festival is? Because I mean, just to put it in context of the history of international photographic exposure that Kathmandu has or had, what kind of spaces were there and why this is kind of different. I mean, the most obvious one that jumps out to someone like, who's not inside, but to me, it seems it's the public exhibitions. And but I'm curious if were there other motivations, and were you also looking at other regional events that kind of have taken a similar route?
Yes, the festival started first in 2015, and that was, 2015. We'd been doing this work for about close to 10 years, and the community here had been growing, and we'd been visiting festivals in the region, other parts of the world, and realizing that something like a festival can become a platform for visibility for the local community of practitioners to invite the outside in, to project the inside out, all of that, right? And especially for us in Nepal, in the context of not having a very developed infrastructure professionally in terms of, you know, disseminating work or photography or creating, you know, possible interfaces with your audience, because we don't have so many galleries and museum spaces that traditionally sort of take that role on. We felt that it was really, I mean, as with everything that we've done, I guess, this very DIY process, and sort of saying that, well, we take charge of how we want to engage with our audiences. And so this festival felt like a good direction to move in. Of course, something like a festival requires a lot of resource mobilization, you know, and it becomes this spectacle that I think has brought a lot of, has enabled many things to happen for local and regional practitioners. But it has also, we've also wondered, you know, as we've worked on this, we've had now 3 editions of it. It takes place every 2 years. We've always also wondered, you know, what it might mean to take that amount of energy that goes into putting on a spectacle like a festival, and stretch it out, you know, to sort of, if we were to rethink, say, duration, and to rethink formats, you know, what kind of engagement. And because over the last 5 years since the festival, there has been a certain kind of new acceptance of photography, I think, in the public sphere, and I think a certain sort of taste for it, you know, and a certain excitement also for it. And so where do we take that, and how do we move forward? And I think this year in particular, given the pandemic, the next edition of the festival is supposed to happen in December this year. We are really now, I think, pausing and taking this opportunity, I suppose we call it, or trying to look at it in that way, to reflect on some of these things and to really sort of rethink some of the format and the durational issues and our relationship to the public also. The festival is primarily anchored in Patan, which is one of the oldest cities in the Kathmandu Valley. And, you know, we've asked ourselves, so far it's been sort of a pop-up thing. We set up, it's there, it's quite ephemeral, and then it dissipates, you know, and then we go back to our regular work. But we're wondering, you know, if we were a more permanent physical presence in Patan as well, what might that allow for? So for this year, I think we're thinking about perhaps, yeah, we found a few spaces, perhaps looking at a more permanent, sort of setting up a more permanent space there. I mean, what is a festival anyway, right? And why engage in this way? And what does being a public engagement initiative actually mean? Like just sticking a bunch of photos out in the public sphere, does that actually create engagement or create access even, you know, in terms of language, in terms of visual language, in terms of all these things? So these are things that we're thinking through, and I think this year, whether we like it or not, we're kind of pushed in that direction. But I think a lot of our work anyway is kind of this, like responding to the situation around us, responding to, you know, the political economy around us, all of that. And so this is just part of that process, I think. But the festival, yeah, is something that I think we decided to stick to our dates in December this year, just to also give ourselves and the community something to look forward to also, you know, because the year it started actually was that crazy difficult year for us here, 2015, big earthquake, so much was lost. And it was a way for us to, yeah, have something positive and, you know, productive to work on as well. So this feels like another time like that, strangely.
Have these festivals made you rethink what you thought about photography as a form and what its use can be?
Definitely. I think these reflections are happening within the community, at sort of an institutional level, but also, individually for each person. Of course, each artist or each photographer or, cultural producer has their own relationship to their craft and why they do it, and they do it for different reasons. But as a community, I think we've always, been, like I was saying, quite responsive to sort of life around us, and also this question of, what role we play or want to play or see ourselves playing, in society, right? As people who put forth provocations, or as people who sort of, document, or as people who might even find ourselves wanting to be like useful in other ways also, and so one of the first things that happened after the earthquake, and this time too, as soon as the pandemic hit, actually, I think this kind of collectivity that exists, around the work that we do, there is, trust, and there is, there is this kind of, instinctive, coming together that happens in these kinds of crisis moments, it feels like. And so one of the first things was to really jump into trying to do some like, relief work, and that was like an instinctive thing. So obviously, as a community of, you know artistic practitioners and cultural practitioners, our work goes beyond just the, the production of artwork necessarily. So I think it's been, I think, I mean, I'll speak for myself. Like, I am constantly sort of negotiating my relationship to, art per se, at large, and why I do this work, what it means for me, etc. I think it's that way for many people. But yeah, in terms of, thinking forward, we obviously, it's been a difficult time right now to try to plan for the future a little bit. There are so many uncertainties, like, of course, at the logistical level, at the resource level, and all of that. But also, really, it has been this moment. And it's interesting because I guess in the earlier days of lockdown, there was a more pronounced moment where people were all wanting to, feeling the need to rethink and everything, right?
Yeah.
And somehow it seems to have, like, I think, wane off, like, evaporated a little bit. And yeah, I think just in the last couple of days, like, we were having one of our, team meetings, and really saying, well, what is this, like, rethinking that we want to do? I mean, is it just like, as so many things can sometimes be like rhetorical, or what are the deeper shifts that are required, and what is required of us, and what is required of, like, the structures that we not only inhabit but are also actively participating in creating, this wider ecology. What is required of that space to actually think of slightly more radical, or alternative or different ways of doing things, and why, like, what is the purpose? Is it just to be relevant and radical and feel a bit better about ourselves? I don't know, or how is it going to actually shift priorities can be at, like, very small and seemingly insignificant sort of levels. But yeah, so there have been conversations going on, and yeah, they will be ongoing, I'm sure.
The space for, again, the public life of art, where is that moving, you think, or the public life of photography, and where do you see Photo Circle in that world?
I mean, there's a really vibrant community in South Asia for photography. I feel, for us, from the very beginning, we've been, really, a lot of our work has been inspired and shaped by a community in Bangladesh, where there exists a school for photography called Pathshala, and a festival called Chobi Mela, and Drake, which is this sort of communications agency, and a whole sort of almost subculture, around photography. And for us, Dhaka is a 1 hour whatever flight. Getting from the airport to Dhanmondi is a whole other thing, but but it's right there, right? And obviously, we talk about this all the time, whether it be in photography, the arts, or whatever, that we're constantly looking to the West. But these are the more sort of, yesterday actually there was a conversation that I was a part of, where we were talking about decolonizing photography, and what that means. And there was this piece, this really interesting piece I read on Decolonizing the University, where they were really talking about the university as a site for excellence versus a site for relevance. And so constantly we're also talking about sort of what kind of photographic or artistic practices do we want to aspire, do we want to create as standards, right? And we're constantly, unfortunately, still looking to the West and institutions and recognition from the West and this and that. Not that the resources come from the West. All of that is definitely something that is a condition that we exist in. But so for us, like, what does it mean to try to break that, right? So for us, this idea of relevance is really, for us, big, I think, in the work that we do, whether it be interdisciplinary work or just photography work, the kinds of community that we want to build. What does it mean for us in to be interacting, to be engaging, in what way, there is incredible amounts of expertise here. There is incredible amounts of sort of, also, what are the spaces we want to create to be able to build this ecology that is more regional and therefore relevant, in a way, not to shut the world out, but really to be not existing only in this like north-south dichotomy, right? So I think it's there's a lot of momentum, I think, in the region, and growing momentum, and we're happy to be a part of it. So
I constantly think about when you mention the the spaces that you can look around the region, and Shahidul Alam's, I think it's called The Majority World, his the photo organization he ran, and as that name says, like, it's that there is a lot else outside of the West too, and perhaps that's what decolonizing begins with. But yeah, well.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and for also kind of, going through all the interesting works that you have been doing with Photo Circle, and we hope, I think there's a lot more to come, and we look forward to all the new activity, and thank you.
Thank you, Shubhanga. So again, thankful for the invitation to share.
Yeah,
And
no, thanks for taking the time.